In this lesson, we will learn about CSS animations. Because animations are inherently visual, we are going to jump straight in to an example page. Here we are in the web browser, and I want you to pay attention to this key feature blue box when I reload the page. So we noticed that it faded into view on page load, but there's a bit more to it than that. Unlike a transition, I didn't have to hover over anything for that animation to occur. And if we take a closer look, so here is another page refresh, we see that the box isn't simply transitioning from one vertical value to another, but instead we see a bounce-like effect, where the box drops down to its standard position and then bounces up and down a bit. Now, behind the scenes, I have adjusted this example page, and when I refresh, there will be 4 blue boxes instead of only 1. So this is an effect that you've most likely seen on a website, where the callouts or featured bits of content fade into view one at a time. CSS animations make this simple to achieve. And again, unlike transitions, the effect doesn't need to be triggered by a hover or a click. It's simply an animation that can begin playing on page load. Now, in this lesson, our goal is to rewrite the code together to create the animation bounce effect. We will also rewrite the code together that controls the timing of the 4 boxes, so that they all don't fade in at the exact same millisecond, but instead are staggered, one slightly after the other. And finally, let me introduce you to one final bit of content on this example page to further whet your appetite for CSS animations. So we can see there is a star, and behind the scenes I just plugged in a bit of additional code, so when I refresh, you can see the star has a unique animation, and it will continue cycling and repeating this animation forever. Now, once we are done with the code for our blue boxes, we will also learn how to animate the star in this fashion. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, so let's get started. Alright, so behind the scenes, I ripped out all of the code that was creating the animations, and I also removed the star and the extra 3 blue boxes. So here we are at square one, just a single featured blue box, and let's work together to create the bounce animation effect. So in our CSS file, let's create a new comment section to stay organized. We will begin by defining and naming our animation. So to begin an animation, we use the @ symbol and type out keyframes, space, and then this is where we get to choose a name. So I will name this animation Fade Bounce. You could choose any name that you would like. Now between these 2 curly brackets is where we include the code that makes up the animation. So for now, we are not applying this animation to any content on the page. We are beginning by creating a standalone piece of code that can then later be reused and reapplied to any content that we would like. So within these curly brackets, I will begin by saying that when the animation is 0% complete, or in other words, when it has just begun, we want the content to have an opacity of 0, so we want it to be invisible, and we want it to start out a bit higher on the page so that it gives the effect that it's sliding and fading down into view. So we'll use the transform property, translate y, -200%, so it'll be pushed up. So this is how content should be styled when the animation is just getting ready to begin, when the animation is 0% complete. Now when the animation is 100% complete, so when the animation is finished, we want the opacity to be fully visible, and we want it to be positioned vertically where it would normally sit. So transform, translate y, 0. Now these 2 states on their own, the 0% state and the 100% state, are not going to create the bounce effect. We will revisit this code in just a moment to work towards that bounce effect, but for the time being, we now have an animation named Fade Bounce that we can apply to elements on the page. So we know that this box, or this div, this blue key feature 1 box, has a class of box A. So within the rule or selector for the box A element, we can now say animation name, fade bounce, animation duration, 1 second. And if we save and refresh, we can see that our animation is taking place. Albeit it's not a bounce yet, but the animation that we created, named Fade Bounce, is indeed firing on page load. And because we set a duration of 1 second, our keyframe rule is transitioning between 0% and 100% over the span of 1 second. So if we increase this to 3 seconds, you can see the animation plays out very slowly. And that's not what we want. So let's change the duration back to 1 second, and let's focus our energy on the keyframes rule and add intermediate states between 0 and 100% that will create the actual bounce effect. So at 40% completion of the animation, we actually want it to be fully visible and sit vertically in its natural state. So I will just copy and paste this line of code. So we want the remaining 60% of the animation time to be about the bounce effect. So let's say at about 55% completion of the animation, we want it to bounce up a little bit. So this line of code positions the element back in its natural position. So let's have it bounce up just about 6 pixels. Now we're not complete yet, but let's save this and see what it looks like. So we saw that the element bounced once. So here's another refresh. It bounces once and then it's done. I think it would be nice if we added a second bounce that's only 3 pixels. So to achieve that, we can create a few more intermediate states. So let's say at 70% completion of the animation, we want it to be positioned back again in its natural state. And then at 85% completion, we want it to bounce up 3 pixels from its natural state. So if I save and refresh, we see the bounce effect. Here it is one more time. In terms of vertical movement, I think it looks great. But in terms of opacity, I feel like we're fading to full opacity too soon. So I'm going to move this line of code from the 40% state down to the 70% state. So that way it will take longer to transition to fully visible. So here is the updated effect. It's a subtle difference, but I believe it's an improvement. Now that our bounce animation is complete, I'm going to head over to the HTML and add back in the other 3 blue boxes. So we see all 4 boxes once again. However, they bounce into view at exactly the same moment, and we want them to be staggered, so one slightly after the other. By default, an animation will play immediately on page load. Now that behavior is fine for our first box, but we need to add a delay for the other 3 boxes. Now there is a property named animation delay that will let us achieve just that. In our CSS file, we see that we were adding the animation properties to the box A rule. Now, all 4 of these blue boxes have a class of box A. So if we want to add a delay to only the second box, we need a unique selector besides box A. Now, we could dig into the HTML and manually add a class of second to this box and manually add a class of third to this box and fourth to this box. But that's a bit old-fashioned. Instead, let's simply make sure that the common ancestor element of all 4 boxes, this div with the class of row, let's make sure that it has a unique class, boxes. Now, in our CSS, we'll target the parent div, boxes, and then we can write :nth child 2, box A. So this selector will only select and target the second box. Now we can use the animation delay property and provide a value of 0.5 seconds. So if we save and refresh, we see that boxes 1, 3, and 4 animate immediately, but box 2 waits 0.5 seconds before animating. So now all we need to do is duplicate this rule and select only the third box and tell it to wait a full second. And then let's also duplicate the rule and select only the fourth box and tell it to wait 1.5 seconds. So now if we save and refresh, we see that all 4 boxes are staggered or offset by 0.5 seconds, However, our effect still doesn't look quite right because we need our content to be invisible while it's waiting to be animated in. So we need to adjust our CSS, the base rule for box A elements. Before the animation even occurs, we want the opacity to be 0. Now, because we are making the element's default opacity 0, we need to use a special property named animation fill mode and provide a value of forwards. This way, when the animation completes, the web browser will use the 100% completion state as the permanent values. Without this property of animation fill mode forwards, once the animation completes, it would then use opacity 0 again. So with this line of code and this line of code in place, if we save and refresh, we see that we have successfully offset or staggered the timing of the animation for the 4 boxes. Now, before we move on to the rotating star animation task, I want to let you in on a bit of a secret. We don't need to type out these 3 animation-based properties on 3 separate lines. We can use shorthand and use a property named animation, and then provide all of these values on one line. Fade bounce, 1 second, forwards. So that simplifies all 3 of these lines into one line of shorthand code. So when we save and refresh, there is absolutely no change. Our code is just that much cleaner. We know that practice makes perfect. So we've experimented with CSS animations on these 4 blue boxes. Let's practice once again by trying to recreate the star animation that we saw earlier. So in our HTML, I'm going to paste in the code for the star. So if I save and refresh, you can see here is the star. Now I will point out that the image element has a class of star assigned to it. And in our CSS, the only code that's currently in place are a few properties telling it to have a width of 25% of the available space and to have a height that is proportionate to that width. Now that we are on the same page, let's go ahead and write the code to create an animation for the star. So in our CSS, @ keyframes, and then we can name our animation. I will call this slide spin. You could name it anything that you would like. Curly brackets. Let's start simple. For now, let's only worry about sliding the star horizontally to the far right edge of the available space. So we'll say at 100% completion of the animation, we want to use the transform property, translate X, that is horizontally, and push the content 300% from the left. So when we use a percentage value with the translate function, the percentage value is in relation to the size of the element that it's being applied to. Or in other words, 100% is the exact size of the star itself. Now the reason we used 300% is because we know the star takes up perfectly 1/4 of the available space. So by saying 300%, we're telling the star to move over 3 times its own size. So 1, 2, 3. So that way, its right edge will be perfectly aligned with the right edge of the available space. So with this very simple animation code in place, let's add the slide spin animation to the star class. So within the star rule, I will say animation, slide spin, 2 seconds. So if we save and refresh, we see that the animation completes, but then it very roughly and abruptly resets back to the far left. So again, we can use the property animation fill mode forwards, so that when the animation completes, the star will simply stay on the right. Now you will remember that in the beginning of the lesson, when we saw the star demo, it didn't just play once and then stop, it kept playing. Now there's a property named animation iteration count, and this controls how many times the animation will loop through itself. So if I say 2, the animation will play twice and then stop. Now if we want it to loop on forever, we can provide a value of infinite. And as you might expect, the animation will then loop through itself infinitely. Now it looks a bit odd that the star animates to the right and then performs a hard reset to the left immediately. So what if we wanted the animation to backtrack itself, so in reverse, every other pass through the loop? There is a property named animation direction. And if we provide it a value of alternate, we see that the star smoothly transitions to the right and then smoothly backtracks on itself and plays the animation in reverse to get back to the left side. So now that our animation smoothly slides to the far right and then back to the left and alternates infinitely, we simply need to add additional states within the keyframes rule to perform the rotating and change in size scale that we saw earlier in the lesson with the star. So when the animation is 50% complete, let's alter the scale of it. Transform, scale, 0.5. However, because we are using the transform property, which we are also using for the horizontal positioning, we need to include that the translate x should be 150%. So that way, when the animation is halfway complete, we are positioning it halfway horizontally. 150 is half of 300. So if we save and refresh, you can see that the star shrinks in scale when it's in the middle of the horizontal space. Now the only effect that we're missing is that we want the star to also rotate or spin when it's in the middle of the horizontal space. So let's create another state. At 75% completion through the animation, we want the star to stop moving horizontally for a moment. So we'll provide it an identical horizontal translate x value, so it stays in place. But we want it to rotate 180 degrees, and we want it to remain at a scale of 0.5. Now we only want the star to appear as if it's rotating when it's in the middle of the horizontal space. So we want the change in rotation to be between this state and this state, because the star is staying in place horizontally. Now because we don't want there to be rotation between this state and this state, we will edit our final state to also say that it should also have a rotation of 180 degrees. So now when we save and refresh, you see that the star is using the exact same animation that we saw in the very beginning demo of the lesson. Now once again, I'll let you in on a bit of a secret. We can use shorthand to say that the animation should use a name of slide spin, duration of 2 seconds, it should loop through infinitely, it should use a direction of alternate, and it should use a fill mode of forwards. So with this line in place, we can remove these lines, and if we save and refresh, we see the exact same effect, only it took up less lines of code. So we've completed the 2 examples for this lesson, the blue boxes and the star. But before we close the lesson, there's a very important note. Our animation code will run perfectly in Firefox and recent versions of Internet Explorer. But if we want this animation code to run in Google Chrome, Apple Safari, and the majority of smartphones, we need to adjust our code just a tiny bit. Step 1. Anywhere we define and name an animation using the @keyframes rule, we need to copy the entire animation rule, paste it, and then in the original first copy, after the symbol, include -WebKit-. Step 2, anywhere we use any of the animation-based properties, so whether that's the shorthand animation or any of the other properties like animation duration or animation iteration count, any animation-based property, again, copy the line of code, paste it, and on the original line include -WebKit-. That's it. If you perform those 2 steps on all of your animation-based code, your animations will run perfectly in essentially every modern device and browser. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close. At this point, you should be familiar with the basics of CSS animations. Now, we have only scratched the surface of what's possible. And if you're hungry to learn more about animations and transformations, be sure to check the description for this lesson to find information and inspiration regarding what else is possible. Have fun, and I will see you in the next lesson.